reeked of death, and of the feeble, dying struggles of a multitude of delicate creatures desperate to make their escape. "This is crazy. I've never seen anything like it." Toby poked the end of the stick of hickory that he'd picked up at some point during their ride through the woods at one of the dusty square boards. He flipped it over, sending up a small cloud of yet more of that cloying dust that seemed to be the glue holding this crappy cabin together. "There must be at least 100 of them." Reese nodded, but he didn't reply. There was something deeply awe-inspiring about this dark, desolate place. He wanted to come here for ages, ever since he first heard about it from one of the older boys at school, but no one had been able to tell him of its exact location. He and Toby had come across it almost by accident, although finding it had been the unspoken reason behind today's excursion out here to this seldom visited part of the woods. The cabin was small, with only 2 main rooms and a third, more compact, 3-walled room outside the front door, had his grandma called it a lean-to, that looked as if it had once been used as a bathroom or a laundry. Inexplicably, the sink or tub had been ripped out to leave the plumbing pipes broken and exposed, a sight that was unsettling enough in itself. The first main room was plainly the kitchen and living room, and the room they were in now might have once been a bedroom, although there was no sign of a bed or any other furniture save for a fixed counter that ran along one wall beneath the window. The counter had dark shadows beneath it, and Reese had already decided that he wouldn't look too hard at them. The exterior of the building was constructed of rough hand-hewn planks, and each grimy window in the structure was serviceable rather than picturesque in both nature and size. Not that there was much to look out if anyone cared to peer through the dirty panes from the inside of the cabin, as the woods here were dense with dark, twisted trees and rambling, out-of-control foliage and vines. Scenery of any different kind was pretty much non-existent. Reese had realized at once why people said the cabin was hard to find. It blended into the environment as if it had taken root and grown up from the dank soil like a darkly living, breathing thing. "Look at this one." Toby was still turning over the collection of boards with his stick, fascinated by the array of flying insects pinned to the balsa wood and styrofoam tiles. "Have you ever seen a moth this big?" Reese gave the huge creature, a flattened insect with beige and orange wings that touched each side of the board at their outer tips, only a cursory glance. The decaying, musky, almost sweet smell in here was making his nose itch, and he didn't like the feeling of 1,000 dead eyes watching him. "Why are they all still here? There's nothing left in the cabin except for the pinning boards. Why would anyone leave their butterfly and moth collection behind but take everything else with them?" "Dunno." Toby set his stick to one side and squatted down in front of the faded brown and orange moth. He spread his fingers wide and held his hand above the insect, measuring its expansive wingspan from a distance. "It's bigger than my hand. Imagine seeing one of these flying around your backyard." Macy would scream. Macy was Toby's twin sister, and Toby loved nothing more than tormenting her until she screamed, although Macy was inclined to give back as good as she got. Reese thought she wasn't too bad for a girl, and sometimes she was even nice, but he would never tell either Toby or Macy that. Reese skirted around the scattered boards, being careful not to stand on them for vague reasons driven into him by his mother, and stepped back out into the living area. That other room gave him the creeps, although he'd been dying to see it ever since he first heard about it. He'd always been interested in the things he wasn't supposed to look at. "Come away, Toby. It's not a pleasant sight." His grandma's voice echoed back to him, wending its way across his memory to his ears. That was 2 years ago, when he was only 10 and Grandma was still alive, and they'd come across a car accident on their way to the store. The car was a mess of twisted metal and leaking fluids, and there were plenty of people gathered around to help as the wail of an ambulance screamed its warning in the distance. Grandma had roughly grabbed his upper arm and dragged him away when he didn't move fast enough for her liking. Still, he dragged his feet and looked over his shoulder, straining to see as much as he could before she hauled him around the street corner. This room didn't smell as stinky and rotten as the other room, but the thick layer of dust still made his nose itch. He rubbed his nose on his sleeve and bent to open the broken cupboard door beneath the rusty old sink. The cupboard looked as if it had scratch marks on it, but he tried not to think too hard about that. Long gray cobwebs hung down in tattered strands from the curved bottom of the sink to the cupboard floor, and a once bright yellow plastic container lay on its side, the edge of a black skull and crossbones icon just visible on what remained of a tattered, faded label. Poison. He was suddenly disconcerted by the too real feeling that something was staring back at him from the deep shadows at the back, way over past where the container lay. Eyes. He hastily closed the cupboard as best he could and backed away. "We should leave soon," he called out to Toby. We have to find our way back yet, and it's getting darker. We're a long way into the woods, and it's at least an hour's bike ride back to the highway, and that's only if we pedal fast. I'm gonna take some of these boards with us. We need to get some proof that we were here, otherwise people won't believe us. Clark is gonna be pissed that we found the cabin. Yeah. Reese had no further interest in the butterfly boards. Before he'd seen them for himself, he'd imagined them as pretty, jewel-like specimens, ripe and bursting with the bright, effusive colors of nature in all its glory. However, there was nothing attractive about those drab, dirty bugs with their crisp, dried-up bodies and ineffectual wings. It's called entomology, Toby continued, spinning the word easily off his tongue. The study of insects. Yeah. Reese hadn't known that, but he wasn't about to let on to Toby, who already had a big enough head about his own supposedly superior smartness. He walked across the leaf-littered floor and made a small circle on the pane of one of the living room windows with his finger. The glass felt greasy beneath his touch, layered as it was with grime and filth. The sun didn't reach every corner of this part of the woods, and in some areas, it was hard to see even a glimpse of the sky through the heavy canopy of leaves. The watchful feeling intensified. We should leave now. Toby's shrieked cry ended abruptly, cut off mid-scream for some inexplicable reason. The boy's choked-off cry was accompanied by the sound of feet frantically scrabbling across floorboards, followed by a heavy dragging noise, and there was silence. Reese's heart pounded painfully as he hesitated, oddly caught between the idea of running to his friend's aid or getting the hell out of here. He'd never had to measure the depth of his courage before, and now that he was faced with the possibility of having to do so, he was mildly surprised to discover that he'd rather turn tail and scarpa than stand and fight. Toby? Stop fooling around. Reese took a cautious step back towards the bedroom. I said I want to leave. I don't like this place. He was already imaging the comforting security of his bike seat beneath his rear, his hands on the familiar grips of the handlebars, and the dim green light of the forest flashing past as they retraced the route that had brought them here. He was starting to wish they'd never come, but it was the first fine day they'd had in weeks, and both he and Toby had cabin fever and were eager to get out. The silence grew deeper, overlaid by a sinister sense of menace that was palpable. Reese had to physically force his feet to inch another step further forward. Grab a couple of the boards and let's go. Mom's cooking fried chicken for dinner, and she might ask you to stay over and eat with us if we get back early enough. The enticement was supposed to be encouraging, but instead his voice sounded weak and breathless to his ears. He'd reached the doorway now, and one more step would take him past the doorframe and into the room. From here, he could see a slurry of boards spread across the floor and the faint outline of their footprints in the dust. The hickory stick was lying in such a way that it pointed like a long, accusing, gnarly finger to the spot where Reese now stood. Toby? Reese's horrified gaze took in the sight of Toby's lifeless body pinned to the wall with long, silky strands of cobwebs. His own half-formed scream died in his throat as his ears filled with the noise of frantic fluttering and a strange chirping sound. Frozen with fright and powerless to move, he watched as a pair of enormous brown wings descended to engulf him and drag him into endless oblivion. They haven't found those two kids yet. One of them has a twin. This last bit was pulling hard at Mike's emotions. He knew the inexplicable bonds that tied together siblings better than anyone, even if he'd never had a twin of his own. Yeah, we were talking about it at work today. Amber walked up behind him and leaned her arms comfortably across his shoulders. She peered down at the news site that he had open on the laptop in front of him, and her breath tickled his cheek. One of them, Reese, he's Jill Gordon, who works in the hospital cafe's neighbor. Well, his family is. He's not the twin though. He liked it when she leaned over him like that. He could feel her breasts pressing into his back and smell the faint strawberry scent of her hair. You're nice and warm, he murmured. She reached past him to point a finger at the screen, just beneath the picture of the boy's freckled, open face. That's Reese. Jill said she sometimes paid him to mow her lawns. She said he's a good kid, a bit cheeky at times, but what 12-year-old boy isn't? The problem with living on the edge of a national forest is that they hardly know where to start searching. The kids could have entered it at any point and gone off in any direction. They apparently didn't tell anyone where they were going. They were on bikes too, which makes it harder. How are the search parties supposed to know where to begin? He shut down the lid of his laptop and turned to pull her down onto his lap. He nuzzled his face into her neck, lightly nipping her skin with his teeth. "You smell good. Don't." She placed her hands on his chest and pushed herself away so that she could see him, although she didn't move herself away from his lap. "Maybe we should volunteer for one of the search parties. I feel as if I need to do something. They're already saying that it's proving difficult to coordinate all the volunteers. Half the town is out there searching." He started to ease his hand down inside the back of her jeans, but she jumped up before he could get as far as he'd hoped. "Yeah, and I hate the outdoors, but I'd like to help. They can't just have disappeared." She stood in front of him with her hands on her hips, all 5 foot and a hair's breadth of her, perfectly adorable from head to toe. She had on her serious, thoughtful face, the one that he'd fallen in love with the very first time he'd seen her. She'd been wearing her nurse's scrubs then, and she'd stopped at the store to buy milk and bread at the end of her shift. She'd reached the counter and the checkout clerk had rung up her purchases before she realized she hadn't brought her purse, and of course he'd immediately offered to pay. He sometimes joked to their friends that he'd got himself a wife for the cost of a loaf of bread and a half-liter of milk, but she'd never found the quip as funny as he did. "The forest area is massive, honey. It goes on and on for hundreds of square miles. There are valleys and ravines, rivers and creeks, and all kinds of wild animals. It's a dangerous place." Talking about wild animals, he playfully grabbed for her again, his eyes glinting mischievously, inviting her to join in the fun. She didn't take up his invitation. Instead, she slapped hard at his hands, hard enough for it to sting. "Don't, Mike. Why do you always have to try to turn everything into a joke?" "Sorry. I wasn't joking about the kids. I'm sorry they're missing, and I'm sorry for your workmate Jill, but honestly, everyone knows that you don't go too far into those woods unless you're prepared. The weather has been shitty over the past few weeks and everything is damp and wet. There are some dodgy trails in there too, old tracks that should have been closed up long ago, and there's always dodgy people around these days. They didn't even tell their parents where they planned to go. No one has any idea where they entered the forest or where they went after they did. They're just a couple of kids. You can't tell me that you stopped to think about preparations when you were an irresponsible 12-year-old, dying to go off on an adventure with your friends. Hell, you barely stopped to think about preparations now." Her voice now held a sharp edge of brittle ice that she didn't try to disguise. He frowned and turned back to his computer, annoyed that she'd brought the subject up yet again. They'd argued about this too many times already and he was done with it. She knew where he stood. He didn't want kids yet, he wasn't sure if he ever wanted them, but he didn't always think far enough ahead to have a pack of condoms in his bedside drawer. She couldn't take the contraceptive pill because of the disastrous effect it had on her mood swings, and she told him plainly that buying condoms was up to him, or at least he had to remind her that she needed to pick some up in the weekly grocery shop, because men had to face their responsibilities. There was no way she would ever take the morning after pill or anything like that, and yeah, he understood her point of view in that regard. However, writing by condoms on the shopping list never seemed to feature high on his list of priorities once the throes of passion had passed. She turned away, huffing to herself before walking stiffly back to the kitchen where she started slamming things around with more force than it probably warranted. Mike sighed, opened the laptop, and clicked back into his news article. She was an amazing wife and he didn't want anyone else but her moods tended to be volatile with or without the complications of the pill. And lately, they'd gotten worse. She fired up easily, but then she just as quickly simmered down again. Hey, it wasn't as if he didn't enjoy her fiery nature. Passion was a fine and wonderful thing. Anyway, he knew the drill by now. He would keep himself to himself and let her make the first move. Anything for a peaceful life. He returned to the place where he'd left off reading the article earlier. As he'd just explained to Amber, the search coordinators were concerned about the challenging, unpredictable terrain once they got deeper into the forest. North Knoll wasn't a real mountain by any stretch of the imagination, but it was hilly and sheer in places. Eager volunteers were complicating matters by organizing their own search parties, and authorities were worried that vital evidence might be trampled under too many overeager feet. Mike knew areas of the national park as well or better than most people in the region. He had lived in this town since he was a kid, arriving here with his parents at the age of 11 when his father transferred to the area for work. The offer had come at just the right time for the family, and Mike's mother and father had jumped at the chance. While reluctant at first, Mike had soon learned to love his new home and he thrived on the small-town lifestyle after spending his earlier childhood as a mid-sized city boy. He knew enough about the forest and the outdoors to be wary of it while still enjoying its ample pleasures. The woods were a great place for hikes, treks, picnics, camping, fishing, and hunting, as long as you always remembered that nature always held the upper hand. The weather in this part of the country was inclement, changing rapidly from sunny to stormy with very little warning. Rivers could rise in the blink of an eye, periods of wet weather could cause sudden landslips and rockfalls, and high winds had been known to bring down majestic, ancient trees as easily as if they were matchsticks. Despite his flippant comment about not going into the woods unless you were prepared, he understood how a young boy's mind worked. 2 kids on their bikes wouldn't have given such practicalities a second thought, he certainly hadn't when he was their age. Amber walked by on her way to the bedroom to change for her shift, dropping her hand down on his shoulder in a brief offer of conciliation as she strode past his chair. "Don't forget we're going to Sandy and Adam's for dinner tomorrow night. Louise and Joe are going too. You might want to pick up a couple of bottles of wine." "Yeah. I will." He gave the expected bland reply, signaling without stating it outright that their little squabble was now over.